All right, so we'll move on from our into the document here. So this document here we can go over. It's got the licensing warranty information here. It's going through the data sources that we're going to look at in this course. And then we've got, you can read through this in your own time. It's what's new in the 2019. So this document will focus on the 2019 install 0.0, but we will be talking about 2019.1 features in it to get you up and running with it. Here's the course overview. So everything that you need will be incorporated on your VM here, so you can go through all the exercises with us in real time. And everything, again, should be installed on your computer. You've got the Apache Tomcat, your desktop, your server, and then we also have a SQL database. You can find all your data as a location here on your computer as well. Okay, so we'll go through the planning for an installation. There's a lot of considerations, a lot of reading that you need to do before you decide that you want to install FME server. A lot of these choices can be changed, but it's better to have a good understanding of what you want before you begin, because in most cases, if you do an express install and you want to start building it up from there, you're going to have to completely uninstall that and reinstall everything again rather than expanding on it. So first of all, we're going to talk about requirements of workspaces. Those workspaces have to be in the same version or the same, at least, year. We have forward compatibility, but not backwards compatibility. So your 2019.1 should be okay if your server is 2019.1 with a 2019.0 workspace, as long as the engines are up to date, and that's the main thing. If at all you can keep it in the same exact version and exact builds, you're going to have the least issues that way. The grid shift files can be uploaded to FME server the same way you can change your grid shift files on desktop. So that's something to pay attention to, and it's always a good idea to make notes within the workspaces that this requires a grid shift file, or if there's something different going on, if it's going to require additional changes to your server. And that way it makes it easy when you're publishing those to FME server that you can see, oh, I need to add this in there. Same with third-party applications. Sometimes you need to have plugins, and that's another good spot where you can mention that a plugin exists. Most plugins you can simply upload into the resources for FME server, and you can get running there. But there are also a lot of considerations like FME ArcGIS, where you have to make sure you have the proper bit version for your software. Python, there have been some changes lately. In 2019, we're starting to deprecate Python 2.7, so that's something you need to pay attention to. If you want to install with Python 2.7, you have to opt into it. By default, you're opting out of having that. So if you have a lot of workspaces that are reliant on this and you still want to use the 2.7 Python library, you have to opt in at install time. The web services will automatically be pushed up when you send it across to FME server. You have the option to check and say, yes, I want to include that. It should be there by default. So the web connections should work the same way they should on desktop. Same with database connections. Database connections and web connections, you have to be concerned about what ports are open and does your server have the ability to connect to it, but the connection themselves should work exactly the same way. Are there any questions at this point? Okay. So you can also use your packages now to go up to the hub. So if you have a package or a grouping of transformers or a custom transformer, you can push it up to hub now and bring it and bring the whole package over at that point. So this is something that you might want to check out. It's a new feature to FME server, and we're building out the hub to make it more accessible from desktop and server. It's the FME server architecture, where you can basically split things into a client side and then the server side. On the client side of things, you have different services that can connect to FME server. So you have your web services. This can be something like the FME job submitter, where you just want to send off a job. You have the web clients, such as the interface there, and then you have the console, workbench, and you have any custom web applications that might use the REST API. So you can either call the REST API directly, you can have it included in email, or what you can do is have it embedded into your own custom workspace or web page, and then it can be triggered automatically and run a job from there. And then on the server side, you have the process monitor. This makes sure everything is running and that no components have failed. It restarts anything that might have failed. You have the repository manager, which will help you when you publish workspaces up to FME server, register them with services. So every workspace has to be registered with the service that you want it to, whether that be a download service, or if that's just a submit service or a streaming service. And we'll go through those later. The database, this database isn't going to hold any of your actual data. This is just for configuration. And you're going to have a couple options here to use either our default database, or you can use a database of your choice. The server queue, this component is wrapped up within the core, but I mention it because it is its own process. It is a Redis queue under the hood, and it's going to let you pile up or move or prioritize your workflows from there. So it's a good component to be aware of, because you can also add in new Redis queues if you want. Then you have your file system. This is where you're going to store data. If you're going to temporarily upload it, we recommend that you don't long-term store a lot of data up there, but you can. It just can become inflated. It makes it also hard for migration. So we always recommend that you host your data somewhere else and you just use FME server to interact from one spot to another. And then you've got engines, and this is the raw processing power that FME has. This is what's going to take your resources. This is where all the magic happens, and it should act the same way as desktop does. You have your scheduling manager, which is quite evident, and then you have your notifications. So that's emails, triggers, anything that's going into FME server, coming out of FME server automatically. And then last, you have a WebSocket server. So if you have any WebSockets that you're attaching to. So here we have the diagram, and you have the various components of FME server. So again, the front end client side here. Basically everything goes through the REST API. We'll notice that you're probably familiar with Workbench. Console is a component where you can actually run jobs through the command line, but the vast majority of clients find that the server API does, it's much easier to set up and be dynamic with it compared to the console. And then on the server side, you have the core, and this goes through a number of the processes that the core includes. You have your file system, which is attached to the core, and then you have your database, processing manager, and then as many engines as you want. So on FME server, you can install the engines on the same machine, and an express installation, it would all go on the same machine. But you also have the option to install on different machines. You can also install 2 different bit versions on the same machine if you want. And then you have your server core, and your server core, again, holds all those processes that wrap around the engine and make it really useful and facilitate communication internally and externally to other applications. Got the queue. Again, the database I'm going to touch on again. You can set this up to use Postgres, Oracle, or MS SQL. The nice thing about having one of the latter two is that you can have your own fault tolerance built into those databases. with things like SQL, you can have authentication based upon the user rather than having the password and username in the configuration. We'll skip over file system because I went over that, but the web services, we'll go into those in a little bit of detail. These are different services which your workspaces need to be registered with when you set it up on FME server, when you publish it. So this is one of the drawbacks, is that you do have to pay attention when you push a workspace up to server. You can't just drop it into a repository. You need to specify how you want FME server to use this workspace at publishing time. So data download would just take your data and download it directly back into the web browser. So you'd get the data coming back from the workspace. Data upload uploads it to FME server. Data streaming streams it across. Usually this will take an engine and require it to run constantly so you can stream it across. Job submitter is just a simple submit the job KML link if you want a link embedded in up on Google, or you can have that to automatically refresh. The data is pushed up there. Token security, it allows you to send a request across or send a link across to run a workspace, and that user can use that token to run FME server. They don't have to have specific login, but you can give them a token for it, and you can have an expiry date, or you can go away and take away that token at any point. So it allows users who are not frequently logged in or don't have access to log in to be able to do that. And then we've got a REST API, so that's going to allow you to make calls and to the server to do any variety of jobs. And you've got notifications, again, which includes your emails and triggers. There's a whole plethora of things that we can go through there. A lot of it you should have gone through in the authoring course. If you did, if you're interested in what those notifications are, you can go back to that course. Move on to installation types. So in FME server, you have two basic installation types. You have the express install and you have a distributed install. The express install installs everything directly onto your one machine. It does it without much configuration at all. So it's a really easy way to get up and started with FME server. It's almost like a sandbox in some way. You can just pop it up and away you go. It is a proper install though, so it is going to give you all the functionality you need, and in most cases it's what people are using. Unless you've got a big organization or you've got a lot of constraints or security constraints, the express installation is going to work very well. If something happens with it, the nice thing about express install is it's really easy to reinstall it. If you have good backups, you can get backup in no time. So the express option is a good long-term option for a lot of companies, especially depending on their size. The other option is your distributed fault-tolerant installation. This is going to allow you to have certain components of FME server fail and it still chug along. So in this scenario, what you're going to have, you can distribute a lot of these different components, but we're focused on a few scenarios. In this case here, you would have your client up top, and then you'd have your web, you'd have your core, your file share, and engine all on one machine, and then you'd have your database and file share separate. This kind of gives you the opportunity to have a fault-tolerant database and a fault-tolerant file share system. And then from there, you can separate out any of these components that you want. Sorry, this is the queue. Into different servers if you want it, but most cases, again, at least keeping the core, the web, and the queue together is going to be beneficial. One of the nice things that you can have about a distributed installation is you can have your core and everything together, and then you can put your engines out into different places. You can put your engine on a server that's close to your data, so you're going to have less network problems or it's going to be quicker to run through. One of the nice things also about distributing those engines out is you can have departments just directly for a specific engine or a server, and that way they're not going to be taking in any of the resources, whether it's software or the actual running of FME server or just the hardware requirements for that server. You can also build out from there, so there's a lot more options to scale when you're looking at a distributed installation. So again, you can do your separate engine installation if you have a distributed installation to begin with. So that's one of the major concerns is if you choose distributed and you don't have distributed engines, you can always add them on, whereas on Express, you'd have to uninstall and reinstall for that process. And you can keep adding as many engines as you want. There's no restrictions on that. The FME server core can handle dozens of engines. It's on different machines. It's not going to be an issue to scale out from there. You're not going to have to expand the number of cores that you're using. And then in here, you also have a silent option. So with your silent option, you can set up a script to go through the whole installation if you want. It can make it easier if you want or doing this on a repetitive basis. If you're always upgrading the process, if you have a script, it makes it easier. You know what you did last time. You can just run through it. So moving on to fault tolerance. There's two main points that we want to talk about: recovery and redundancy. So recovery is to make sure that components come back and that it will self-heal. And then redundancy is to talk about having those components that are existing in two places in case one goes down. So in 2018, we introduced a new type of fault-tolerant configuration. The fault-tolerant configuration that we have is an active-active configuration. So it means that you have two core machines or two machines with FME server on that are both going to be active at the same time. There's no longer the version of an active passive installation. If you want to have something that's more passive, you can do another install and have a complete, basically, disaster recovery install in a new place. But right now we're working with an active, and you can use all the engines and everything should chug along if one of the components fails. We've had built-in recovery for a long time with FME server, so if certain processes fail on the core or an engine fails on the any machine, it should automatically restart it. That's what the process monitor helps look at to make sure everything's running and restarting failed components. You have the job recovery. So the job recovery is going to look at if a job fails, will it be resubmitted? Now, these are variables that you can set up on your server. If you want only one failure to trigger a complete failed job, and rather than resubmitting it, you can do that yourself. And then you also have the option to have those jobs restart the engines if they fail a certain number of times. So if it's running through and it fails once, you can say restart the engine, there's something wrong with it, or you can say, oh, after 10 times, which is the default, then the engine will restart. So here we're going to look at some of the architecture. We're going to go into the diagrams. This is the redundancy of it. So we can have the redundancy that you want built into it. And by separating it apart and having more redundant parts, I guess there's more you have to take care of. If you keep it together, it's going to be a little bit more easy to manage. So the first scenario here is what we recommend is just simple. You're going to, again, have those key components on one machine, that being the core, the web, the queue node, and an engine. And then you're going to duplicate that process with a second failover engine, failover machine there. They're both going to be, I used to use the term failover, but they're both active. So they can work interchangeably, but there's a redundancy there. The points that aren't redundant would be a load balancer. You're going to have to provide your own third-party load balancer for this installation. And you can expand it out as much as you want. So you can do another core installation where you have everything together and just keep expanding laterally if you want. The other components that there's going to be a single of is your database. But if you use your own database, again, you can incorporate your own fault tolerance in there, and the same as the file share. The other nice benefit of having these components down here shared between the two is that means expanding this out in terms of either adding engines or adding more cores is a very simple process, because everything that these two installations need to communicate or understand that there's another core there are held within the database and the file share. So it makes it really quick to come up with a more distributed installation. If you have security concerns about the web servlets, you can expand out your own web application. You can install your own, and that way you can update it separate from the FME server. By default, FME server comes with its own Tomcat installation, and if you're going to an express install or you're putting them all together, you're going to have to if there's an upgrade process for that servlet, you're going to have to wait for FME server to come out with the next release and use that, opposed to separating out where you have a little bit more control. The other benefit of this model here is the distributed engines again, and we'll go into some reasons why you might want a distributed engine a little bit further down, other than just having it close to your data or having another point of redundancy in there. So one thing to note about the fault-tolerant installations is your UDP and SMTP publishers are not supported in this configuration. You can try some interesting things with the load balancer to try to get those to work, but officially they're not supported, and we're trying to encourage people to use IMAP. I'm not sure if people are using SMTP much anymore, or if it's something they plan to have in their next installation. Would I be able to get hands up to see who is using SMTP or is interested in that publication? So that's being able to take in emails and process them directly from FME server versus IMAP, where you'd have your own email account and be pulling that. Okay. Thank you. That's great. So the load balancer is really up to the users. We've done several different types of load balancers. Nginx is one of them. It tends to work better on Linux systems, but it's completely up to you. It can be a physical load balancer, or it can be a software load balancer. They have to be really simple. They don't have to be complex. You're just pointing at one server or the other based on a health check and we've got some examples online if you want to take a look at it. And I'm going to go into, I've got an example later on in the training where we can take a look if you want. I've got a link to it. Take a look down here at a scenario where we have a failover. I should mention though that the tracking core failures, when an engine fails, also your log is going to be rewritten. So if your job fails and it's resubmitted, your original log is going to be overwritten. So sometimes it's hard to track exactly what went on. But again, if you adjust the numbers and you say, okay, it's going to fail under one account, and you can just resubmit it later with another process, you can have REST calls to go through failed jobs and resubmit them at any interval you want. So in the failover scenario here, we've got two basically configurations into one. We've got one where you've got the core including the engine, and you've got one where the engines are distributed. So in the event that this core number one goes offline and you have an engine on that machine, what's going to happen is that engine license is going to be released back into the pool, but you're going to have to manually up the number of the engines through the web interface to the second core. Whereas in the distributed installation, what's going to happen is those engines are going to move directly over to the other core. So each core will have an owner of its engines, and it'll basically be able to submit jobs to them and other engines, but it'll be the owner. In those cases, the owner is going to switch over. If an engine goes down, it's not going to affect the way the core works. Obviously, the core won't be able to submit any jobs there anymore, but the core should be aware that this engine has gone offline. So again, you would need to be able to up the engines on the web interface to be able to maximize the number and get back to full capacity. One of the concerns though with upping the number of engines, if it's not made for it, is your machines, you have to make sure you have the RAM and the memory and the CPU to be able to handle the extra engines. So if you get basically beyond one core processing unit per engine, normally you'd see some slowing of the engines or the process. So optimizing it, you really want one core per engine on your machines. So these are the considerations and why we don't automatically throw things over or push all the engines. If there were 10 engines on your first core and it failed, all those would have to be moved to your second. But if you did that, then your second machine might grind to a halt if you don't have the capacity on it. Then we'll talk about disaster recovery. Disaster recovery is a different concept. We're talking about a complete failure and having a backup there. In FME server, since we've got an active-active architecture, you could potentially have the disaster recovery plan where you have a second data center which can take up the process once this fails, so you could have everything installed on it. You'd have to have the capacity to have that failover there. One of the nice things again about Express installs is it's super quick to install. So if you had a machine or virtual machine which FME server is on and it went down, to be able to spin up another, install FME server and back it up is a relatively short process. We're looking under an hour for sure. And that's potentially one backup workflow you can have. Most small shops, this should be fine. If you're not relying on processing, or you can handle an hour of outage, this should work fine as long as you have good backups. I'm going to reiterate this later in the course again, but one of the important things with your backup is to make sure that when you're doing, first of all, regular backups, and second of all, that those backups are going to a different machine than what your core or engine. If you can do that, then you can ensure that you have solid backups that you can use at any time and that all your configuration is there, which makes it easier to come back up after a catastrophic event. I should mention though, if you do want to back it up, you're going to have either have a load balancer on the front or something to redirect the traffic, especially if you have REST API calls set up to go to a specific server. If you're going to a backup data center, your names are probably going to be slightly different. So if you have a load balancer out front, you can just keep things moving as properly. Otherwise, you are going to have to start looking at who's connecting to the server and who's using the previous URL or host name. Again, security updates are up to you in terms of having a distributed system and being able to update those individual components like your database or your web services. Otherwise, you're going to have to wait for the FME package and Express install, and we'll update that. We continually update those every build. Again, these are options, so it's really up to your organization and what their protocols are for this. I'm going to talk about the super user here for a minute because that's going to be the most important role, or the role that your admins are going to have. This role is important because it will allow you to do backups and restores and a few other functions that admin users can't. So the super user is a very important role. Also, by default in 2019, the admin is going to be installed with the password admin to begin with, and this has the super user role. So no longer are you able to specify my account is gonna, my new user account, and this is gonna be the super user. It's gonna be admin by default, and you can change that after the point. And then if you want to have that super user be an Active Directory role, we have a method for doing that as well. But out of the box, as soon as you get started, it's just admin, and then you start building the server from there after installation. Firewalls and ports. We have this good document on our FME server document page, which goes through all the different ports that you're going to need. Most cases for an express installation, you're looking at localhost, or everything is not going to, most of the communication is not going to be going outside the box, but it's a good idea to have a few of these open. There are a range of ports that we use. In some cases, so the services are 72 to 76. Database communication, maybe you have your own specific database port that you want to use. Again, you're going to have to make sure that's open. But as a rule, if you follow this guideline for these ports, you're going to be okay with it. And if you really want to refine it down, we can help with that. The licensing is one thing that you might have to, if you want offline installation but only have one port open, you're allowed to do that too, so that the licensing comes up. But an offline installation is a valid way to do it too, and then you just have to worry about internal ports. So when you're setting up your server, you're going to be asked for a host name. The host name, we should be prepared, it shouldn't just be your server name. If you want it to be your server name, that's fantastic. But if you want it to be a public facing and you want a URL up there that everyone can access with the domain on it, then you're going to have to set that up at installation time. And of course, don't use localhost if it's going to be accessed remotely. And then we've got a section here on running FME server system services under different accounts. This is essential to do if you're doing a distributed installation. You need these components to be running on a different service so they can talk with the file share primarily, but it also helps for the different processes, the engine specifically, so they have access to what they need to have access to read and write or go through a proxy. So this is one of the key steps, and we're going to go through it. Generally, you want to use a domain service account. You can also use a group managed service account for this service. So there's quite a lot of variation in here in terms of how you want to, or what account you want to run it under, and help you have it centrally controlled. So what we can do is just go through that really quickly here and take a look and change the service accounts. So I hope everyone who's wanting to go through the exercises has their machine up and are ready. So what we'll do first is we have our web server interface. I've got obviously the two screens here, so hopefully you can see them both. What we're going to do is find our services. And into here, we're going to look for our FME services. So we should see 4 of them. So we've got the application server, we've got the core, database, and engines. Now you can start your services directly from here if you like. You have to pay attention to the order that you start things in though. By default, if you try to start the core, the database should come up. But typically you'd want to try to do it in order, which means the database first, then the cores, and then the engines. The application server, the web application, could be started at any time. It doesn't matter as much. But the other 3 should be started in order. So we see here that the logon, in this case, is under the local system. So what we're going to try to do is change that to a user. So if we right click on it and we go down to properties, we'll get some information about it. We'll click to the logon tab here. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to switch it up and we're going to try to look for the count that we logged on to these VMs with. So we'll browse, we'll look at our computer, and we'll look at FME admin. Okay, let's go to the advanced here. Okay, so there's our administrator. So we can click on that. So it should be FME Training Administrator. Click OK. And then in here, we're going to use the password that we used to click on to or sign on to our VMs. So it's just FME Learnings. #1. So this is giving me a little warning and say that I need to restart the service before it comes on registered under this account or logged on this account. Does it work? Okay, so we'll go through. I'm spelling it wrong or something. Okay, so once that's all set up, we can again either restart the services here, which sometimes can give us a clue if anything's going wrong, or we can go into our application and click restart the services. All this does is restart these services in order, but we can take a look and do it this way and see if we have any issues here. So restarting. So if there's a bad login, it should prevent us from starting it. So go to database, restart this. So you can see when you're restarting the database, it also restarts the core. Okay. So that looks good, and then we'll doesn't look good. So it couldn't stop the database, and then there's a problem with it. So we can go back and we can start it the other way if we want. So let's give it a shot from here, because otherwise I think we'll have to stop them all and then restart them. You're going to get a few when you start the service this way. The service name is invalid errors. You can ignore these for now. So now it's saying system error 1068. So it looks like I entered the password wrong for the database. So let's see if we can do this again. Make sure we have the right account. So right now we can't get this up and running. Maybe I have the core wrong. Or even better, we can just take this and copy it in. Okay. All right, so what we're going to do here is, and often what we need to do for the services for the database is have it run under the local service account. So we're going to change that back. Local systems account, apply, OK, and that should restart the whole process. One of the things I wanted to look at is the tasks that are running to give you an idea of some of the processes that are happening within FME server. So under the processes here, if we go into the details, we can find some of the FME processes. So we're going to look at all these processes here. These are all under the core, and these are the different publishers, the notifications. We've got the server application, the WebSocket. So you can see it's not as refined down as just four processes. So sometimes if you have an error in your log and you're looking for something specific, or specific process, you can go here and check to see if it's running. One of the things I'll point out too that is not registered or labeled as an FME process is the Redis queue, and that is again our queue that we use for queuing the jobs. So that's a good one to pay attention to. All right, so we should be up, and then we can move on to testing out to see if it's working. We can go through first step here and then we'll continue on later. But if you just refresh your browser, it's logged us on automatically. It looks like it's all up and running. So scalability is a concern that we want to, or something you want to think about when you initially get started with your installation. Again, Express is a great option and allows you to expand the number of engines on that machine. But if you want to expand out and use different machines, your machine might be limited by its processing ability. Then you're going to have to uninstall and install a distributed system. So if you think this is something that you are going to need in the short term, or in a couple months down or a year down the road, be able to expand out, might be good to go with a distributed installation. With the distributed installation, you can still essentially do an Express in the way that you're installing all the components on one server and maintaining it there. It just allows you the flexibility at any point to be able to expand into a fault-tolerant system or a distributed engine system. Again, one of the great benefits is keeping the engines close to the data. Or you can have it in a specific bit version. So some applications might need 32-bit, so all those jobs, and it can be sent to a specific machine which runs a 32-bit FME server engine, while the core can run 32 or 64-bit. You can even have crosses in between the operating systems, so you can have a Linux core and a Windows machine or vice versa. So there's a lot of flexibility here in terms of what you want to get out of it and how much of your workflow is dependent on these Windows systems versus Linux, or 32 versus 64-bit. So that's probably the biggest thing that takes most of the time, is figuring out what you're using it for and how do we design it for that. So in this module, we should have looked at the Express installations versus the distributed fault-tolerant installations, briefly mentioned the silent installations. We have some documentation about how to run those processes. If you run an install, you're going to get an automatic installation script, which you can use as a template. It has a bunch of variables in there that most of them you don't need to pay attention to. So you can refine it down just to the key ones that you want, say specify where the file system goes or the database, rather than having the entire list of variables. We went over the fault-tolerant installations, and then for skills here, we looked at the service account and how to change that. Okay, we're back. We're going to take a look at the post-installation configuration. So everything else before, obviously, is before you install considerations. Now we're going to work through some more practical things that you can do once you've installed to make it more secure, or do the variation distributed database or other systems to be able to configure it for your environment. So we're first going to verify that our install worked okay. So we should make sure that the web application is running. So it is running. As we can see, typically if you log out and you see the point where you have to log in, it's just proving that the web application is running. It doesn't mean the rest of the server is. Once you can log in and see everything here, we're assured that our database is up and running and the core is up and running. And then from there, we can check to see if the engines are running or not. So we can go through the licensing process right now. And similar, you can actually check to see if the services are running from the services panel that we were looking at before. So if we shrink this down, we can now see, if we refresh, that they're all running. And then again, Task Manager, you can go in there if there's a specific task that you think isn't working, you can take a look there. So from the web interface, we can log in. Again, you're using admin from the login. And then once we get there, we can take a look at the engines and licensing. We did it as the installation that you get will be installed with the host name of localhost, so you won't be able to access it outside the VM or anywhere else. It's only directly through the VM where you can actually access the server. Right now we have it configured to use HTTP, so no SSL is configured out of the box, but we'll be going through that later. So if we go down to configure, we can take a look at what's going on here. This is where you license it. This is where you see the engines. This is where you see the hosts, the machines that FME is installed on. So to begin with, the licensing, you'll see nothing down here if you haven't licensed it. So we'll request a new license, and then you can send it all in. You can also do an offline method for requesting a license, or you can upload a license file here. So the offline method here will be clicking there, and then you send in the JSON generated to codes, and then we'll generate you a license and send it back. Here we can see that we have two engines, engine 1, engine 2, and they're on the host called FME training. You can see the platform they're on, and you can also see the jobs that are running on it, or if there's a job running on it. Right now there's nothing. Under hosts, you should see all your new hosts there. And we've got a license here with 10 engines. So if we want to see, we can upload this number, up the number here, say 6 engines. If we change that, it will automatically change the number of engines that we have on this host, and we should see them starting to appear right there. So now we've upped our capacity. And then lastly, you have the queue down here, and we'll talk about queuing later on in the course. This can be a very helpful page too. So this basically is a diagram of your installation. The components in here roughly match what you're going to see in terms of the core and engine process, but there's slight differences. The main thing we want to look at is the job router. So this is your Redis queue. This is the queuing mechanism here. You're only going to have one of them active, even in fault-tolerant installations. The other one is going to be passive. If a failover event occurs, it will become active. You're going to have your engine manager. So this is basically the core process that distributes the engine, the jobs to the engines. You're going to have two of them active at the same time in a fault-tolerant installation. So you'll see those two connected. And then you have all the engines associated with it. So these are all on the same machine. We can tell because they're all within the dark gray box, but you can have distributed engines down here that you can see as well. You can click on these nodes and see what port they're working on, what the name is. So sometimes you want to not have localhost here if you have a distributed installation, and that should automatically take the name of the host server that you entered at installation time. So to move on, we can take a look at the jobs and make sure we're running. So let's see if the engines, it looks like the engines are up and running from what we can tell there. It seemed to be adjusting to increased engine number, engine count on that machine. But let's run a job and make sure. So we'll go to the samples, Austin Apartments, and then we're just going to use, it's registered with these 4 services at the time that it was published. These are one of the default workspaces, so it comes with the installation of FME server. We'll just do the job submitter service. So basically we're just sending it off, making sure it runs, nothing fancy. Okay, and it's running, it looks like. So is it queued? Is it running? It's completed. So if it's running, you'll see it in here. If an engine isn't available, you'll probably see it in the queue because it'll be submitted, it can't find an engine. So if this queue gets backed up or looks bigger than what you expect it to look like, means usually that an engine is down or not running. So we have a successful installation. So we can move on to changing the database provider. Again, you can use a database of your choice. If it's Postgres, a Microsoft SQL Server, or Oracle database, the process is pretty simple. It's just repointing the core at the new database, but you do have to set up the database first. It's much easier in 2019 compared to especially versions like 2017. There's no post-install scripts to run. As soon as you set up the database, run the database scripts, and you're able to connect to that database, FME core will then cause these post-install processes to run on the database, and it'll come up to speed. So one of the things that we do recommend if you're looking at using your own database is when you're installing, install with the default database. It's easy enough to turn off and uninstall the Postgres database that comes with FME server after you've set up the database on another machine. But what it really does is prove that everything else in the installation is working as expected, and that makes it easy to refine down what isn't working if you reconnect it to another database and it's not working. So we can jump right in here to the exercise. So the first thing we're going to want to do is back up the FME server. And in this exercise, we're going to be using Microsoft SQL database, and we're going to set that up with the install scripts and then repoint FME server there. So we'll go down to the backup and restore because we want to keep all the configuration here. So that's the other nice thing is that if you are upgrading at a certain point, or you do want to start with an express install and you just want to test out FME server and just make sure it runs, it's easy to get up and installed, and then you decide, yes, I want to do this, I want to move it into production. With a backup and restore, it makes it a very easy process to be able to then install your distributed or your grander system that would be production worthy, and then just restore all the configuration that you spent the last couple of months testing and working on. So what we'll do here is we can either download to either the resource location or directly into the browser. The resource location can be handy, but if you are uninstalling your server, it's going to be gone afterwards if it's an express installation or if something happens to the machine. So it's usually a good idea to either download it to a different location. Here we'll just go through the browser, so we'll download it. Again, this is a process that only the super user can do. I can see the file downloading here. All done. Checking our history. Looks like it was successful. What we can do is confirm the backup before we move on. So you can either overwrite existing files or keep what's there. Let's overwrite them. Let's upload our configuration file. Import. Great. Looks like it was a successful backup and successful, so we can move on assured that all our data is there. Completed. So now we have the backup file. What we can do is move on into the installation of the database. So what we'll do is, I'm going to shrink this down. I'm going to work with my screen like this for a minute and then move back to the manual side. But we'll do is we'll look for our SQL server, and what we're going to just point out the various tools. So we've got the Management Studio there, and the other tool that we might be using later is the configuration here, Configuration Manager. So to begin with, what we're going to do is try to launch a command line though, because we're going to do this all through the command line. We want to right click on there and we're going to run as administrator. So we've got our command line up, and then with the installation of FME server, there are the database scripts. It's important to remember, or important to use, the database scripts provided by the installation. So you always have to install first and then set up your database. Another good reason to use the default database. If you use the scripts from a previous version of FME server, your server isn't going to run because there's going to be changes in the table. Pretty much every version that we put out, or at least major version, there's a change in the structure of the database. So make sure you use those provided only from the installation. Okay, I guess we can connect now if you want to, but this is unnecessary at this point. All we want right now is the command line. So there we go. We'll go through that later. So you have all your scripts in your C folder here. You'll have your create database and then your create user. So what we're going to want to do here is use the command line to run the script using the SQL command. So we can just copy it there. Again, all it's doing is running that script. You see that all these rows are affected. It means that the script, or in most cases, the script ran properly. So we're going to have to then change the owner here and set up the database user. So we can set up the second one, copy it. You can take a look at the scripts if you want. In some cases, you can do some tweaks to the scripts to allow for the securities that you want to have in place and change the ownership, or if you have rules around that. But it's recommended that you just keep the scripts the way they are. We're going to apply the second script here, change database Contacts to FME server. So that looks good. So at this point, it looks like we have a database. Next, we can go to the configuration file and we can take a look at that and then change the provider or the backend database. This is how you repoint FME server. So open our files. See, if you install a 32-bit, your program would be here. I've got 64, FME server, and then FME common config. So we'll open that up with Notepad. We'll roll down. So we've got this comment section above and it goes through everything, and then we've got the actual configuration down below. So we can see here that we're using a Postgres database on localhost at 782. What we're going to do is comment all these out. We're going to move down to our Microsoft SQL Server. We're going to uncomment these. Now we're just using the driver that's installed with FME server. If you want to use your own driver, you can. It's an option. Again, you can specify that up here, or you can specify it at installation time. So that looks good. Now we've got this section uncommented. And also, if you are looking to have integrated Windows authentication, this is where you'd also put this in. You could put you'd have to have these left the way they are, but at the end of your URL string, you can use integrated Windows authentication, sign up your service account to use the account that you want to connect as, so the account using the engines and core, those processes should be that account that you want for the integrated Windows authentication. Looks good. So we'll just save this. And we'll close it down. And then what we're going to do from here is open up the Management Studio. So again, Microsoft Management Studio. It's also down here. We're going to open it up, look at our databases. And we can see we have an FME server database. Take a look at the tables in here. Looks good. We never really want to be doing any editing to these tables. If you do anything in here, it may cause something to break on the FME server side. So typically, if you want to change anything in the database, there's REST calls that can affect the tables that you want. It's better to go through that method. You can always take a look, see what's in here, maintain it, or you can even, I've had some clients write scripts on the database to be able to do their own statistics on that. So you can do that, but retain the tables the way they are if you can. So we'll go back to the documentation, and what we're going to do is just open up the properties here. So we've saved that, we've changed it, we've opened up the Microsoft SQL Studio. We're just using the server name FME training. That should be in there by default. Same with the login. We're right-clicking on the database themselves and clicking properties, and then we're going to switch from from Windows authentication mode to the SQL Server authentication mode, because we're supplying the username in that configuration file there. And then after that, we'll restart the database. So click on the Security tab, SQL Server, Windows Authentication Mode. Okay. So again, we have to restart the service. We know it's running. We've got the little green arrow there. Let's restart it. Yes, I want to restart it. Great. So we'll go back to our server at this point and we'll restart it. So if you go down to the right-hand side, go down to your server, we'll restart FME server. So again, we're just changing the connections there. So you can see it's starting the database, but this is the database that we have installed by default. This isn't the one we're pointing to now. If we uninstall it, it won't bother trying to start any database. It'll be completely up to the user, and those two processes won't be dependent on each other. So let's log out. Try to log back in here. There's potentially one more step that we need to do on these boxes. So could not connect to core. That means that we can't connect to the database. So we'll go through a little exercise here where we try to find out what it is. So we're going to go to our program files. By default, those will be the file share will be installed under program files. So click on C, our program data. We've got safe software. We'll go under resources, we'll go to logs, we'll go to core, we'll go to current, and we have logs here. So this means that at least some of the core processes are running. Since we changed the database, we can pretty much guarantee that it's a problem connecting to the database at this point. And then we'll go into the log and see what's happening. So here we have the database. There we go. So the TCP/IP connection to the local host on port 1443 has failed. So I think that is a good thing to check. So we should check to make sure that we are able to receive connections on TCP/IP and that the port is open. So what we'll do from here is we'll launch on the side, go find our application, SQL Server 2017 Configuration Manager. We'll launch that. From here, we'll find our database, so it should be the second one down. And then in here, we see our TCP/IP connections are disabled. So we'll probably want to enable that. Let's go to the properties and make sure our ports are good. So we want to go down to the bottom here to all, and we're just going to use a static port here. So you can put your number in here. (1433) is what we're using. So again, got to restart the service. Let's click OK. Go back to the Management Studio here. Restart the database. And we'll see if we can view FME server trying to reconnect at this point. So FME server at this point, it can't connect to the database, but it should keep trying for a while. So let's see if it's doing that. If not, we'll have to restart the core, but we can go back to the login page and see if anything happened automatically. So it looks like we're connected, but it hasn't properly run the post install scripts. So we need to restart FME server. Core started, engines are started. So let's refresh this page. Let's go back here. Go admin, log on. Still can't connect to the core. So let's review, make sure, oh, might want to enable the shared memory. That's enabled. Pipes. Enable that as well. Make sure that our changes were static and that we are indeed. So we can go back to the config file. We can open it up, make sure that everything else looks good compared to the config file. FME server, FME common config. So 433 FME server. Great, so that looks good to me. Stop it. Start it again. Great. We'll go back to the login page, or we can go directly from here. Sometimes this ensures that we pick up the configuration that we have changed in there. If we use a port that we forgot about, sometimes if we log in through the web user interface there, it'll automatically put in those port numbers. So the login failed usually means that, again, it's able to connect to the database, but we're not able to log in. So there must be something in here that's preventing the FME server user from logging in. We can double check that we have also reset the properties here under the security tab. Make sure that took effect. Yep. Okay, so at this point we can take one more look at the log, but we might have to hold off on this exercise. But it looks like the ports should be open. It looks like our TCP connections are enabled. It looks like the database is there. So we can restart the server one more time. And then we can go back to the log files where we were before, and we can actually see this starting to come in real time if we want. So program data, save software, server, resources, logs, core, and then we'll go to the current one, do a refresh. We'll just wait for the core to come back up online. It's the same error again, so we're looking, oh no, different error. Failed to log in user FME server. So that makes me think that the post install script for the user didn't work. So let's go back and take a look, see what we ran here. So take a look at the database. So all we're doing here in this one here is we were executing this script to that server name. So that should have given us permission. So our machine is called FME training /SQL Express. So that's correct. So let's launch a command prompt again. Make sure we've run it as administrator. We'll go back, we'll grab that user, copy it. So since we ran this before, it already exists and it should be in there. So our login information should get us through at this point. Since it was also saying a login error there at that point, we can take a look at our configuration and make sure that there's nothing else in the name FME server. Oh, here we go. Let's save that and we'll reconnect again. Okay, so from here we should be up and running, and we can start looking at restoring the backup. So we should have the backup in our browser. We can grab that and reinstall just the same way we did previously. Let's make sure we're all connected here. So I see that the script ended, which means everything should be up and running. Okay. I'm gonna do another quick poll and see if everyone got through the debugging there and that your server is running. If you need a hand, do you want to put your hand up right now? We'll see if we can get you running with getting the studio up and running, getting the TCP/IP connections. So interesting enough, we have FME server here now running, but we've got another scenario here where the backup or the post installation hasn't run. So what we're going to need to do is either give it more time. There we go. And that's all it needed. So those scripts should be run automatically. But if you do see something like that, you can be assured or see that you can connect, but nothing shows up. You either don't have permissions, which shouldn't be the case for the Superuser, or the post-installation scripts haven't run. And in this case, it just took a little bit longer to run. So we'll go back down to backup and restore. We'll restore the server. We'll upload a file. It's the one we just downloaded. Open. Overwrite existing items. And away we go. And then we can make sure that everything is running again. Great, so now the new database is connected. Our old one is still running, so we could uninstall that process. We could stop it. We're looking for the Postgres under the tasks, stop that, and then uninstall it. From installing it, then your FME server core should not be dependent on starting the database anymore, and it should automatically go out and connect to your own personal database. You can leave them both running, but I'm not going to go through the uninstall process right now. So we'll look at adding engines. You can add engines to new machines, or you can add engines to existing machines. To add an engine to an existing machine is simply just upping the number here under the configuration like we did before, and you'll have another engine process on that machine. If you want a 32-bit engine and a 64-bit engine on the same machine, though, you have to go through an installation process. One of the problems with this process, though, is in the engines and licensing page right here, you're not going to have it display correctly. So you'll have the engines available. You can set up your queues. You can do everything. It's just not going to be visually as easy to see. But you can do that on the same machine if you want. In most cases, the processing that people are going to be using, it's easier just to have a separate machine with that 32-bit engine. So you can also secure your server with HTTPS, SSL. We can go through that right now. We're going to be using a self-signed certificate. There's a lot of different certificate options you can use. And we could go through those with you if you want. A lot of it is undocumented, or your IT should have a method for doing it. The methods that we're going to apply directly towards FME server in terms of the configuration files, that process would be exactly the same as long as you can import that certificate and you can get it to work for your web browser. So we'll move on to the SSL here, the configuration. So first of all, what we're going to do is open up the command line as admin again, and we're going to run some some commands here to generate our key stores. We're going to move our key stores after that, and then we're going to import the certificates. Once we've done that, that process is for the certificates. Then we're going to go down and alter 3 configuration files for FME server. And we've got templates here that you can use for these scripts. Today we're just going to use those. If you obviously see differences, like your password is different, you can change those. But these give a template for what you need to do, and then it's just a matter of restarting FME server. We're going to be using port 8443. The choice is 443 or 8443 is up to you, but we'll walk through it. So let's open up the command prompt again. Should be up and running. Based upon what we had before. We can close it down if you want, and just to be sure, again, go through it. More, run as administrator. I'll shrink this up again so we can see the documentation and we can copy and paste over. So what we're first going to do is go to the bin where all, our Java bin where we can create a new key store from. So this is installed with FME server. Program files is your default installation directory. And then we're going to create a new key store here. So it says enter password. So we're going to use Tomcat as our password here. First and last name, we just want to use our host name, and so in this case it's going to be localhost. And then everything else we want blank until we get down to the bottom here, and then we're just going to click return again. So is this information correct? Yeah, it looks good to me. And again, you can configure this in more detail if you want. And then we're going to return if it's the same as the key store password, which is what we're going to use here. Next, we're going to copy this key store to the Tomcat directory. What we have to make sure we do at this time is it's copied and not moved. The command obviously gives it a copy command here, but often people move it and we need to have it in both locations for it to work properly. All right, so now we got to import. We have to import the key store for the trusted certificates. So we'll copy that. And it's destination key store password. That is going to be change it. And then the source key store password is going to be Tomcat again. Great. So now what we're going to do is move on. We're going to go to the configuration files for FME server, and we're going to change a few details in there. So we can shrink up that command prompt now. We can go back to our directory, and now we're going to be going into the default install program files, FME server, utilities, Tomcat, configuration, and then you'll see the 3 files in there plus a few more. So back to C, program files. So we're going to edit the FME server first to begin with, the XML with Notepad. So we're going to find the listener object here, the element, and we're going to replace it. So we're looking for something that says class name Apache. So it's right here. So let's take our new line, we'll copy, put it below, and you can either delete this line or you can comment it out. So we want to SSL engine off. Next, we'll take the next element here. We'll find the connector protocol here. This is for the connector, so we'll scroll down and see if we can find that. It's usually pretty easy to see. So this is it there. So let's see if we can paste it above. We'll copy. Make sure you get all of it, including this last little section here. And make sure if you're pasting it above that this doesn't get commented out. So we'll comment out the old. And we can see we've got a redirect port. So if we try to connect on 80, it's going to take us back to 8443 there. And it's going to go through our protocol. So let's save that. And then what we're going to do is open up the next file, so the web XML file. So we've got web, it's XML. And we're going to scroll all the way down to the bottom here. And we've got right after the closing web app element, which is right here, we're going to copy our text and we're going to pop it in. It's nice to have well-formatted XML in here, but for it to work properly, it doesn't have to be. So we're just going to leave it like this for now. You can clean it up later if you like. So now we'll close and save that, or saved, we're good. Move back on to our last one, which is our context. Copy our element, and we're going to put it right down at the bottom before the closing context tag. So at this point, what we can do is restart our server, and it should pick up the new configuration. So we'll go down. I'll close these down. Great. So what we're going to do is open it from the start button here. So let's open it from the FME server web interface. And we'll see if what happens by default. Should pick up the fact that we have a new port and that we're using HTTPS. So you can see here that it's using SSL on 443. What we're going to want to do here is advance through this. You can put this as a accepted site into your security permissions, so you don't have to go through this every time you connect. And this is a trusted site, and documentation for FME server exists in there, so you can take a look at that and move forward. You're gonna have to do it on all the client machines though. So let's log in. And it looks like we're all good. We can again, after you do anything, any major changes to the way to security or how anything works, you can always run a job and make sure that the engines are connecting and that you haven't locked yourself out of any process. So that's always a good habit to have. There was an error submitting the job. Let's try it one more time, see if it's just that the server's not back up. Oh, you know what it is? It is the fact that we need to set up the URLs. So we're going to go back down to our system configuration, go down to, I believe it's networking, and then we've got our services in here. So these are the services that you use to run jobs or processes that the workspaces or jobs run under. Right now we can see that they're all using HTTP. So we want to change all the hosts here to use our new URL. So let's change that. So we'll change all hosts, and we're using port 8443 and it's SSL enabled. It's nice, it fills it in for us. We can click OK. You can see it's all changed. Let's move back and see if we can run a workspace again. It's running now, it completed, so that is the last step under the services. So we change the services to the new URL. And then we also have the option in here, if you're making use of WebSockets, you can set that up for SSL as well. It's all covered in the documentation. Few more things to talk about here in this section, and then we'll take another break again. Encryption is one of them. So if you're encrypting an FME server, by default, FME server database is encrypted automatically. You can use custom encryption keys if you want. Make sure you record that key though, because if you lose that key, there's no way of unencrypting the database. It doesn't mean FME server won't work, you just have no access to it anymore. So we'll go to the general and we'll go to system encryption here. So by default, it's set up as secure, so you've got it encrypted. This is a key that's used on all the installations. If you want to use your own and rotate through it, you can have enhanced security that way. seem to be wanting to register me here, but you can change it to restricted if you want. From there also you can encrypt the password for the FME server database if you want. We've got some methods here to do it, or if you want to use integrated Windows authentication and not have the password in the configuration, you can use that as well. Moving on to proxy servers, there's been some changes in the way FME server uses proxies recently. What you can do now, or at least in the 2019.1 version, is you can enable proxies directly from the URL. So you can specify your proxy, your host, the protocols. You have basic NTML and digest methods for proxy use for authentication. This doesn't cover custom proxy maps or exceptions. If you want to do those, you're going to have to go back in and follow the documentation for setting it up manually. There's two different ways you can set it up, either based upon a local system service running your processes. In most cases you won't, because you'll have a system account running your FME processes like the core and engine. And from there, then you can use a command line to commit those proxies in, and you can use custom mapping from there too. This enhancement here, though, in the web UI also is reflected in the core and engine process. If you go to the old method, you're only going to be able to get the engines, and S3 buckets is your resource for the core. So we're working towards complete proxy integration for FME server. Most cases, you don't need anything in the core, but if you are doing authentication from the core, if you have, say, ArcGIS Online, and you need to authenticate that in the core before it's run on the engines, then you'll benefit from this. If you want to use a reverse proxy, you can do that. It's basically your load balancer out front. We've got the Nginx example here. And then you can follow our recommended configuration for setting up the load balancer the same way you would for a fault-tolerant installation to have that reverse proxy set up. I'll mention cores here. By default, this is now enabled, allow any host to access FME server. But if you want to tighten that up and only allow specific connections, you're allowed to do that. So you've got the origins, you've got the method, the headers, the response headers. It's very configurable. Most cases, you don't need to worry about this. It's set up to accept everyone out of the box, but it's a good thing to mention. So that happened in 2017 to allow all hosts by default. So here we should have gone through licensing, verifying that your server is running, making sure that the database is working that you installed with, installing with a new database, all the things that can go wrong and how to debug those, setting up for HTTPS in there. We talked about cores, we talked about proxies as well. So these should give you the foundations, or at least awareness of these concepts to move forward with it in your own personal installation. Exercise here, and I'm just going to go through some of the troubleshooting steps that I took and some of the symptoms that we saw. So there's a couple components which we did. First of all, we ran the scripts. The scripts ran fine. We could see the database being created, and we could see that the user was added. So it was 2 scripts we ran there. We made sure that we're using the name of our database installation or server here. Then we went through the configuration where we added in our new server location. And then we couldn't connect. The last thing we did before we found we couldn't connect is that we went into the Management Studio, Microsoft Management Studio, and we changed the authentication to be SQL Server Windows Authentication mode. So those are the three main steps that you're going to have to do. So depending on your database and how it's set up, if it's accepting TCP connections or and which ports are open by default, we can go through the additional steps that we did. So when we connected initially, it said it could not connect to core. So that means at this point that it flat out can't find the database. The second error that we got was that it failed to log in. So at that point, we know that it can connect to the core, and the core can connect to the database, and that the connection is open. It's just refusing it. And we found out there that that was because of the password that was in the config file. So that's the first spot to look if you have a bad login and you don't have Active Directory set up. So we'll go back into the studio here, and I'll show you the steps to enable the connections again. So we'll go down to our Microsoft suite here. Go to our SQL Server 2017 Configuration Manager. We'll open it up. And in here we have our database. So we're going to want to click on the SQL Server Network Configuration, because this is the issue. What's our server or database accepting, and how is it accepting it? We can expand it out. We've got the protocols underneath, so let's click on the protocols. We've got shared memory, which can help if you have your database and your server on the same machine. You don't necessarily have to have that enabled. Pipe names are enabled by default. Our TCP IP connections were disabled, so this is where we want to enable it. And then for the details of these connection, the ports we're using, what we're going to want to do is go into the properties. So I'll move this across. So we've got our protocols, we've got a keep alive time here, we've got listen to all, we've got it enabled. Here we've got the different IPs of incoming traffic, and this is for all. So any server here, machine can connect over port 1433. And we've got dynamic ports if you want to use dynamic ports, but because we specify this in the configuration file, we want a static port. So if this is blank, we want to make sure that that's filled in. Click OK at that point. Now it should be all set up. All our networking configuration should be set up for FME server to access it. We can go back to our SQL Studio. And we have a little green arrow showing that our database is running, but we'll right click on the whole database, not just our instance, and we'll restart it. Gives me a warning. Do I really want to restart this? Yes, I do. And we should be connected. So for debugging, really we want to focus on the configuration file. That's the only way the FME server is connecting. So if it's not specified in that configuration file, it doesn't need it to connect to the database. So we'll go back to our program files, FME server, shouldn't be common config, it should be shouldn't be server config, it should be common config. And then we're going to take a look at the database. So here we're going to make sure the password's okay, that there's nothing on the end here. There's if there's anything continuing on, you're going to have an issue on that. So it has to be separated, formatted correctly in the configuration file as well. Using 443, we're localhost here, so we don't have to go out, we don't have to change the firewalls. Our database name is FME server, and we can see that from Management Studio again. So that looks good. And then for the debugging that we did, we'll go back to our program data. See. So FME server, resources, logs, and in here you've got the different components that we discussed earlier. We have the core, engines, queue, you have the different services, so you can look at particularly which ones are running or not running, and then you have your web service, which is Tomcat here. So we clicked on the core. There's really one file which is going to be the most useful in almost every case, which is the FME server log. So we've got our old ones here, so we can take a look at our history and see what we did. Every time FME server was restarted, you get a new log in here and it goes into the old, and the current one is the one that is building. So we can take a look at some of the first logs that we have in here. So this one, 8:30 right here, this one here should have our errors in it. So we've got multiple FME server logs here. Let's open some of them. That one looks like it's connecting okay. There weren't any issues there. Let's go down to some of these larger ones. So the login failed. This is a problem with the configuration file. And it's going to continue. You see it'll continue to say login failed as it tries to reconnect. So this is where we found that the TCP/IP connections were failing. So right at the top, one of the first things FME server core tries to do is connect to the database. So right here we see the TCP/IP connections, the host, local host on port 1443 has failed. Let's see if we can scroll across a bit more and see if there's any more information. It should give us a few suggestions. Often the log files will give you suggestions on how to debug or get through the issue here. So we have it laid out a little more detail over here. Error, connection refused. No further information. All right, here we go. This can be useful for us. Make sure that an instance of SQL server is running. Check on the host, localhost, and that it's accepting TCP/IP connections, which it was not. And on the port that we specified, it wasn't. And then we look at firewalls as well, but because we're all local here and we've installed it as localhost, firewalls shouldn't be a concern at this point. But you can always go into your firewalls and make sure that database port is open. And that was the debugging that I did. Hopefully that should get everyone up and running with their FME server. If they are still having issues and they just want to move on at this point, you can just change the configuration file back to the original Postgres database, restart FME server, and it should connect to the original database. So that is, again, going to conclude what we did in the database, changing the database provider here. And we're going to move on to FME server migration.
So we've only got about 10 minutes left for today. So we're just going to start this backup and migration chapter and see how far we get. And then we'll carry on tomorrow where we leave off today. So performing backups and migration, as system administrators, this might be a fairly common task. So if you're ever doing an upgrade of your system, you're most likely going to be doing a backup and restore. And this is done through the FME server web interface. And we actually did have a go at doing this during the database, changing the database provider exercise. So that way you're taking up a backup, it's taking all of that information from the FME server database, saving it, so when you restore on a new system or if you've changed that database configuration, it's going to put everything the FME server needs to know back into the database so you can carry on with business as usual. So what components of FME server are included in a backup? So we've got a list here of things, so any repositories, which is where your workspaces are published to, and any items stored within them. So like I just mentioned, this includes workspaces, custom transformers, custom formats, any templates and resources, and any designations by users of a repository, such as if you've saved them as your favorite, that's also stored in a migration. As if anybody is using version control, so I believe this was introduced in FME Server 2017. If you're using version control, the different information about the versions isn't migrated in all of those different versions of workspaces. It will only store the active workspace in the backup file. So if you are using version control and you wanted to keep those different versions, we recommend that you perform a push before doing the backup or uninstall. That way it's all saved in your Git repository. When you get the new system and you reconfigure for version control, you will then be able to access the other versions of workspaces if you need them. The FME server services that you've published and registered workspaces with, that will get stored in a backup. Any notifications that you've set up, so any publications, subscriptions, topics, etc. In 2019.1, when this gets released in a couple of weeks, we've included it in the training just because it is so close to 19.1 coming out, so it thought it would be a good idea to make everyone here aware. So FME server apps will be included in 2019.1 backups. As well as automations, which is a new feature for 2019. If you're interested in automations, I recommend that you check out the FME server authoring course for 2019 if you haven't already. And then any security configurations, which we'll touch on in a future chapter, so any users, roles, tokens, Active Directory, system events, which we'll also touch on later, that's new for 2019, schedules, job queues, and resources. So these will be included in your backup. But for resources, there's a little bit sort of more to think about with a backup. You need to make sure that this shared resource is migratable is set to true, which you can find inside your FME server config.txt file, which is located in program files. So by default, the data engine and dashboard resources are configured for migration. But for example, if you've connected to remote network shares and they're appearing your resources, etc., you wouldn't want to include those in a backup file because your backup file is going to get really, really, really big. So you would rather just keep your data somewhere like on a network-based resource. And when you install the new FME server, just reconnect to that via UNC. And then you don't have to worry about making sure all of that data is backed up and copied through FME server. You're just connecting to it where it can live normally. And then the other things that are kept inside a backup file is your database connections and web connections. Just want to touch on a few things that aren't migrated in a backup file. So job logs don't get carried over. So if you did want to keep any of your old job logs, you would have to go and manually back those up. So as Richard's mentioned already today, your FME server system share by default is installed under C program data. You may choose on install to have this somewhere else. Inside there, inside the logs folder, you can go and find all of your job logs. So if you did want to take a backup of those, go and do that manually through Windows Explorer if you do need to keep them. And then we also don't migrate job ID between installs. So every time you set up a new FME server, the job ID is going to start over again from 1. So we don't support migrating that. And I think we do get a lot of customers asking about this. But at the moment, that's not something we support, so you will find that it always starts again from the beginning with 0, 1. I already did mention version control. So if you did have that enabled, the versioning information is not going to be migrated. You're going to need to connect to a remote repository like GitHub if you want to keep that versioning information. And the other thing we don't copy in a backup file or transfer between versions is configuration files. So between different versions of FME server, there's a chance that the parameters or how the configuration file setup is going to change between versions. So we don't copy any of that information. Any configurations that you do through configuration files needs to be done again on your new system. So for example, HTTPS SSL, in that exercise that you just did, you're going through and editing Tomcat config files. So you've got the server XML, the web XML, and the context XML. On a new system, you would need to go and configure those again. But what you could do is before you do an uninstall or move off your existing system, make a copy of those files, not to replace on your new system. Definitely don't recommend that because like I mentioned, the configuration files may have changed, so it may cause it not to work as expected, but more to keep things like that saved as reference material. So things like your FME common config might be good to keep a backup of just for reference if you need to remember what the password is, what the ports you had configured, so you can point it to a database again. But if you are changing build versions of FME server, you will need to configure a new database in there. You can't just point it at the old database because as Richard mentioned, between versions, things are likely to change in the database, so it's probably not going to work if you try and connect it to an old database. And then the other thing that you'll need to remember is if you've turned on encryption and put it into restricted mode, that on the system that you're restoring FME server your backup file to, you will need to make sure it's also in restricted mode and you've got your custom encryption key so you can do that restore. And then there is a note here about the resources folder, which I've already covered. And you can set FME server backup to perform on a schedule. So there is a workspace that's provided that will do the backup for you, makes a call to the REST API and saves that fsconfig file, which is what the backup file is. So you can get that to run on a schedule just in case, worst case scenario, anything happens to your FME server. Having that backup on a schedule means you're likely going to be only sort of lost as much work as it's taken since the last time you did that backup. But in that case, I do recommend getting the backup to save, or that schedule to save the backup file to a location that isn't on your FME server. So I think you can push the backups up to things like Amazon S3, store it in a bucket. So if anything goes wrong with your system, that backup file is kept in a separate location, so it's safe and you can restore from it.